Welcome to the Architecture Woodshop and Digital Fabrication Lab on the Marietta campus of Kennesaw State University. This video is about handheld power sanders. This video will cover what sanders we have available for use in the shop and what type of sanding they do best. We'll also cover what sizes and types of abrasives you'll need to make use of for the sanders. And we'll show how the sanders should be used in order to control the dust that they make. After viewing this video, you'll know what you need to know in order to safely use the handheld power sanding equipment that's available for you to use. A handheld power sander is a power tool used to smooth surfaces or perform minor shaping to surfaces by abrasion with sandpaper. The handheld power sander can be used to sand any material except metals. It's important to properly prepare before you start sanding. That means the following: selection of the appropriate sander for the task, selection of the appropriate abrasive for the task, application of the abrasive to the sander if necessary, determine where you will be doing the sanding, and make the necessary preparations to collect the dust as effectively as possible. There are two primary ways to collect dust when using handheld power sanders. One approach is to use a downdraft table and do the sanding on top of the table. More on that in a minute. The second approach is to connect a shop vac to the sander and collect as much of the dust as possible as it's made. A downdraft table is another piece of woodworking equipment that is exactly what the name says it is. It's a large metal box that has a slotted work surface or table on top. The top is mounted over a fan which produces a downward flow of air and a collection of filters that remove the sawdust from the airflow. In order to prepare the downdraft table for use, reposition the table if necessary, plug in the table, then plug in the sander you will be using. There are plugs on either side of the table. Then connect the shop vac. Position the piece you intend to sand on the table. Turn on the shop vac. Turn on your sander. Then sand away, keeping your work on or over the center of the surface of the table as much as possible. That way, the downward airflow passes your work area on all sides. When you have completed your sanding, in order to clean the downdraft table, with the table running, brush off the top with a bench brush so that any accumulation of dust is captured by the table. Several of the handheld power sanders have dust collection ports that can be connected to a shop vac. The ones that can be connected to a shop vac should be connected to a shop vac, even if the sanding will be done on the downdraft table. The universal small port adapter and hose will be necessary to connect the handheld power sanders to a shop vac. The regular hose for the vacuum will need to be disconnected and the adapter plugged into the vacuum in its place. The universal small port adapter and hose will be necessary to connect the handheld power sanders to a shop vac. The handheld power sanders are stored on the back wall of the shop behind the larger machine sanders. So let's take a closer look at the different types of handheld power sanders. For each type of sander, we'll quickly go through the following: an orientation, how the sander is typically used, what size of abrasive it uses, how to install the abrasive, and how to use the sander. One of the most popular and frequently used of the handheld power sanders is the Palm Random Orbit Sander. This sander is compact with a small motor that produces a random orbit pattern created by simultaneously spinning the sanding disc and moving it in an ellipse. This sanding action produces a more random pattern of scratch marks, than the heavy and difficult to remove swirl pattern of scratches that a circular action alone would create. Palm random orbit sanders are typically used on flat surfaces, edges, or to ease sharp edges or corners. The Palm random orbit sanders we have in the shop use a 5-inch abrasive disc with 8 dust collection holes. The shop's Palm random orbit sanders use a hook and loop system to attach the abrasive disc to the sander. Abrasive discs are installed on the sander by pressing the loop-back disc against the hooked surface of the pad on the sander so that the dust collection holes in each are aligned. Abrasives in the 100 grit range or lower would be considered coarse for this sander. Fine grit for this sander would be in the 320 grit range. To use a Palm random orbit sander, perform the following steps. Position the item to be sanded on the downdraft table. Load the sander with the desired abrasive disc and plug the sander into an outlet on the downdraft table. Connect the shop vac to the sander for dust collection. Then turn on the downdraft table, turn on the shop vac, turn on the sander, then sand the item using light pressure, keeping the sander moving. Turn the equipment off and examine your item. Repeat the process as needed with the same or different grit abrasive, or if you've completed your sanding operation, put the equipment away and clean up the work area. The wood shop also has heavier duty random orbit sanders. These sanders produce a random orbit pattern like the smaller Palm version. Their configuration, however, is more like that of a handheld grinder with a side handle. This sander has an adjustable speed wheel on the end of the motor housing. Heavy-duty random orbit sanders are typically used on larger flat surfaces, edges, or to ease sharp edges or corners. The heavy-duty random orbit sanders we have in the shop use a 5-inch abrasive disc that has a pressure-sensitive adhesive backing. Abrasive discs are installed on this sander by exposing the adhesive on the back of the abrasive and pressing the abrasive onto the pad of the sander. Abrasives in the 100 grit range or lower would be considered coarse for this sander, and fine grit for this sander would be in the 320 grit range. To use a heavy-duty random orbit sander, perform the following steps. Position the item to be sanded on the downdraft table. Load the sander with the desired abrasive disc and plug the sander into an outlet on the downdraft table. Then turn on the downdraft table, turn on the sander, sand the item using light pressure, keeping the sander moving. Then turn the equipment off and examine your item. If necessary, repeat the process with the same or different grit abrasive until you've completed your sanding operation. Then put your equipment away and clean up your work area. Another popular and frequently used handheld power sander is the Palm Finish Sander. This sander is compact with a small motor that produces a small diameter circular motion. Only fine grit abrasive should be used with this sander. Otherwise, heavy and difficult to remove scratch marks may be created. The shape of the pad and motion of the sander make it able to sand into corners more effectively than the shop's other power sanders. Palm Finish sanders are used with fine grit abrasive to produce the finished surface on flat surfaces or edges. We have 2 models of Palm Finish sanders in the shop. One of the models can be connected to the shop vac for dust collection, but the other cannot. The Palm Finish sanders we have in the shop use a 1/4 of a standard 9-inch by 11-inch sheet of abrasive. The shop's Palm Finish sanders use a clip system to attach the abrasive rectangle to the sander. Abrasive is installed on the sander by releasing or opening one of the clips and putting one of the ends in the clip and securing it. The 1/4 sheet of abrasive is smoothed tightly over the sander pad, and the clipping process is repeated for the other end of the abrasive. If the sander is a model that has dust collection ports, use the paper punch to make holes through the abrasive to facilitate dust collection. Only fine abrasives of grit 220 and higher should be used on this sander. To use a palm finish sander, perform the following steps. Position the item to be sanded on the downdraft table. Load the sander with the desired abrasive and plug the sander into an outlet on the downdraft table. If the sander model supports dust collection, punch holes in the abrasive using the paper punch. If possible, connect the shop vac to the sander for dust collection. Turn on the downdraft table, turn on the shop vac, turn on the sander, then sand the item using light pressure, keeping the sander moving. Turn the equipment off and examine your item. If necessary, repeat the process with the same grit. Or if you're ready, use a different grit abrasive until you've completed your sanding operation. Put the equipment away and clean up your work area when you have completed your sanding. If you need to do some heavy sanding on larger pieces, the wood shop has a belt sander. These sanders drive a continuous belt of abrasive over a flat surface on the bottom of the sander. This sander has an adjustable speed wheel on the side of the motor housing. Belt sanders are typically used on large, flat surfaces, and they make a cloud of dust in a heartbeat. So, consult with a staff person if you think that the belt sander is the tool you need to use for your sanding project. The belt sander we have in the shop uses a 4-inch by 24-inch abrasive belt. Abrasive belts are installed on the sander by pulling the tensioning lever on the side of the sander out to release the tension on the belt, if there is one on the sander. Look on the inside of the belt to be installed to see if direction of travel arrows are marked on the inside. Observing the direction of travel arrows, if they're present, place the belt you want to use over the wheels, aligning the edges of the belt with the edges of the wheels. Then push the tensioning lever back in to tension the belt on the sander. You need to test run the sander to verify that the belt will run true. If adjustment is needed, ask a staff person for assistance. Keep in mind that belt sanders are aggressive, and the abrasive belt often loads fairly quickly. When using the belt sander, it may be helpful to clear the abrasive with an abrasive cleaning stick. Abrasives in the 100 grit range or lower would be considered coarse for this sander. Grits finer than 150 are seldom run on a belt sander and usually have to be special ordered. To use a belt sander, perform the following steps. Position the item to be sanded on the downdraft table. Load the sander with the desired abrasive belt and plug the sander into an outlet on the downdraft table. Make sure you check the belt for appropriate tracking. Then connect the shop vac to the sander for dust collection. Turn on the downdraft table. Turn on the shop vac. Turn on the sander. Sand the item using light pressure, keeping the sander moving and making sure that the belt is moving in the direction parallel to the grain direction. Turn the equipment off and always let the belt sander come to a complete stop before setting it down on a surface. Examine your item. Repeat the process as needed with the same or different grit abrasive, or put your equipment away and clean up your work area. The following are some universal truths about sanding that are offered to help you achieve your desired results. Heat is the enemy of efficient sanding. Light pressure and constant movement between the abrasive and material will reduce heat buildup in a concentrated area. Heat will destroy the sander's backer pads, in some cases melting the hooks of a hook and loop system. You can remove material more quickly with a coarse grit sandpaper that's 100 or lower grit. It is possible to sand something out of shape or desired dimension. It's particularly easy with a powered coarse grit. Keep in mind that if a coarse grit is the only grit you use, the surface will be rough, like it was scrubbed with gravel. A surface will only be as smooth as the last grit or finest grit used. Start sanding with a coarser grit than you think you need, evening out the surface and producing a consistent scratch pattern. Then sand with progressively finer grits. When you are sanding through progressively finer grits, you are replacing coarser scratches with finer scratches. You should need to sand less with each finer grit to remove the scratches from the previous grit. Stop and examine the piece after every third or fourth grit to make sure that the surface is consistently smooth. If necessary, go back to a coarser grit to remove coarse scratches or areas of tear out that were not sanded smooth. Sanding by hand, meaning no power, may be necessary to achieve the control needed or to access the nooks and crannies of a detailed piece. Some general tips on sanding and sanding technique related to shape sanding are the following. The objective of shape sanding is to bring the material to final shape or to ease any sharp edges. So if you're sanding to final shape, you just want to sand to the line or to sand to remove the rough machine marks. Use light pressure, starting with a coarse to medium grit. Stop and check your progress often so that you don't remove any more material than planned. Once shape is achieved, move to finer grits if a smoother surface is desired. If you're sanding to ease sharp edges or corners, it takes less sanding than you think. Use light pressure and a fine grit, checking progress frequently. Some general tips on sanding and sanding technique relating to creating a flat, smooth surface include the following. First, sand the surface flat and uniform with as coarse a grit as necessary to efficiently accomplish that task. Then, gently sand with progressively finer grits. Sand the entire surface and don't skip grits. If the surface of wood is to be colored or dyed, don't go finer than 180 grit or the wood will not accept the stain. If for any reason you think that a sander is not performing as it should or needs some maintenance, please notify a staff member who will investigate the situation. Significant safety concerns when using a handheld power sander are the following. Sanding is an activity that produces fine dust that is a health hazard. The primary danger of using a handheld powered sander is getting dust in your lungs or eyes. You must follow the procedures described in this video for using the downdraft table and/or a shop vac for dust collection. You must maintain control of the material you're sanding at all times. Be aware of the location of your power cords and dust collection hoses in relation to your sanding path. Set up your workspace so that you can sand without cords or hoses interfering with the smooth movement of your sander over the piece or area that you plan to sand. Sandpaper is designed to remove material. If your fingers contact the moving abrasive, the material removed will be your skin. You should not let your fingers get too close to the moving abrasive. Whichever sander you use, you must leave your work area clean. If a shop vac was used, return any attachments to their storage area and return the vac to its station. Return any sanders you used to the appropriate storage area. Then brush down or vacuum off the downdraft table with it running. Thank you for watching the video, and we hope you come to visit us in the shop sometime soon.